Hello, everybody. This is another Facebook Live interview between myself as Principal Consultant at Five Oaks Consulting with an interesting leader with who I'm going to talk about what it means to lead with meaning. And I'm at the Interaction Forum 2019, and I'm sitting down with Chris Proulx, the Global Director for Membership and Engagement, or is it Membership and Learning at Humentum?
Member Engagement and Learning, how about that?
Member Engagement and Learning at Humentum, and in a moment I will ask you to explain to our viewers what Humentum is all about. So, hello Chris, thank you for allowing me to interview you for this short interview. Chris and other colleagues at Humentum and myself and colleagues at the Maxwell School have been working for the last couple of years on developing a first pilot product on leadership development, right, in the form of an e-course. And I learned from you about lean design, or some aspects. I learned from you about entrepreneurialism. But the real reason why I wanted to interview you is because I admire the fact that even though you don't specialize in things like leadership and management in the way, for instance, I do, I have found acute insights into an affinity for organizational leadership and management that I wanted to bring to the fore here. I've also learned from you about innovation and entrepreneurship. So here we go. So Chris, for people who don't know Humentum, tell us a little bit about what it is about, because it's actually for people outside of the sector not necessarily so you need to make it a little bit concrete, right?
Yes.
What Humentum does.
Yep. So the way I like to explain it, especially to folks who don't work in our sector, is that we really focus on strengthening an organization's ability to deliver on their mission from an organizational, operational point of view. So what does that mean, right? We help them manage their money more effectively, manage their people more effectively. We help them manage their projects and programs more effectively, and we help them comply with donor requirements and do other sort of risk management. So those are kind of the four things we focus on, and we do it by being a network member organization, right? So that we're working with practitioners and leaders in those kind of capability areas and getting them to learn from each other as well as from other sort of experts in the sector. And so those are the four basic functions, essentially, that we work with. And we really have a sort of a four-part business model, which is we convene, we bring people together so they can share best practice, emerging practice, common challenges. We develop learning, everything from, free online tools all the way up through, kind of intense face-to-face experiences and a lot of digital in there. We have a consultancy service as well, helping organizations implement systems, tools, processes that will strengthen those capabilities and functions. And then something we call insights and influence, which is really about how do we take data from that work and help organizations benchmark with each other, or how do we use what we're learning about the sector and advocate with governments or donors around specifically these operational functions.
Okay, and Humentum has merged, is the result of a merger, right?
That's right.
In the last couple of years. So tell us briefly about what those three constituent parts were and now are.
Yes, so Humentum is a new organization and a new brand, essentially, that was created from three existing not-for-profits that were focusing on some aspects of that model that we were sort of talking about. So that was Inside NGO, which had a big footprint really around the convening in the international NGO space. Mango, which had a lot of work in the financial management space and really helping organizations strengthen their financial management, and did a fair bit of work in the Global South with smaller NGOs, locally based CBOs, et cetera. And then Lingos, which really brought sort of the digital platform and sort of online learning capabilities to the merger. So the three of us looked at our collective models and said, you know what, individually we're addressing a piece of the puzzle, but in terms of this overall organizational strengthening, we would be very more effectively together.
I'm already thinking maybe I should interview you another time about that merger, because mergers, as you know, mergers and acquisitions are slowly but surely becoming more of interest. And to the NGO community, and there would be interesting learning that you could share about what are the structural aspects, the governance aspects, the cultural aspects, and we even just now we were talking about the implications for the team
Absolutely.
size,
Yep.
and team belonging, right? That would be interesting to explore. So I'm gonna
let's just bookmark that. I definitely have lots to say on that topic too.
You do?
Yes.
Good.
So
And that's a
about
plan.
that.
I just have to, my computer is starting to die on
Yeah.
me. Okay, so one of the many reasons why I wanted to interview you is that your work experience, as I understand it, has made you cross over from the private sector into the NGO sector. I'm always interested to interview leaders who have a cross-sectoral perspective. And I've observed how that makes you introduce what I think are healthy notions around innovation and experimentation in the NGO sector. So given your cross-sectoral experience, to what extent do you think leaders in the public, government, and nonprofit sectors need to think and behave differently than those in the private sector to be effective?
So it's interesting to that question, because really I've also had experience in the higher ed sector, as you know, and really kind of running a private sector business inside of an academic, which is a very weird construct. And then I also have public sector experience being an elected official for a period of time as well. And what I would say, kind of looking at that maybe the private sector, I wouldn't say maybe uniquely has, but probably has a stronger advantage of around the topic of innovation specifically are two things. Urgency and tools and methodologies, right? So I think what we're increasingly seeing, at least here in the INGO sector, is a desire for innovation. But the urgency is more, in some cases, to other things, right? The urgency is more to our mission, or the urgency is more to the clients that we serve, sometimes even to the staff, than it is necessarily to kind of say, how do we actually really radically look at some of the things that we're doing and challenge some of our core assumptions? That is harder to do, I think, in this sector. It's proven harder to do. And then
it is, but why is the urgency in the private sector harder or higher?
I think, and it'll be interesting to look like 20 or 25 years from now, right? Because the other thing that's interesting is how private sector organizations are increasingly positioning themselves much more as values-based organizations. And in fact, we talked about it in the opening plenary here this morning, right? Yeah. And you're seeing increasingly, like, especially the newer kind of wave of organizations, say in the last 5 or 10 years, putting values for first and their product second, creating right from the start foundations that are doing good as part of their business models, et cetera. But I think prior to that, the kind of two-part piece of serving their customer and recognizing that customer wins change quite quickly, right? Especially if you're in the retail business in any way. And then, of course, this notion of having to kind of please your investors and your shareholders, right? And those kinds of things tend to have shorter-term time horizons, right? So your competitors are going to out-compete you for the customer if you're not urgent. And your investors, whether they are private investors, if you're not a public company, or they're public investors, are looking obviously for that financial return. So I think the combination of those two things can, when it's done right, produce a really sort of healthy environment for never getting too settled in terms of what you're actually trying to do in terms of either product and services or internal mechanisms to deliver those products and services. And I think, for better or for worse, historically in the nonprofit sector, you've had a little bit more of the long view. And also sometimes what's the right word? The person who's paying is not the customer, which also complicates things.
Yes,
right?
Very much
When the customer is the one that's paying and you have that clear line of sight, then I think it's a little easier to drive an innovation agenda. When the person who's paying for your services is not the same person who's receiving those services, that gets more complicated. Like, so who are you innovating for? Right?
So all of what you said so far, when I asked you the question, so how do leaders in the public and nonprofit space have to lead differently when it comes to things like being entrepreneurial and innovation, suggests to me that it's harder because of the lesser presence of urgency, if you will, that it's harder to still drive innovation and entrepreneurship. So how do they then have to lead and overcome that obstacle?
I think it's, So that's definitely my observation. My observation has been watching leaders feel like it's harder and feel like they struggle with it, right? And so I think to overcome that struggle, I think I think there are like maybe three elements I'm sort of thinking off the top of my head here, right?
That's okay.
One is talent, right? You probably need to bring people into the organization who are just accustomed to that kind of pace of change, right? And who are not as committed necessarily. This is going to sound kind of odd in a nonprofit sense, but not as committed maybe to the mission of the people who have been there for a longer period of time, because you are going to fundamentally need to sort of challenge the dimensions of that.
Yeah.
The second, I think, is to do work around how to maybe do some work at unpacking that value chain and really sort of understanding and questioning those relationships with your funders and your donors or other revenue sources that you have, and then the clients and communities that you're trying to serve, because that's what's happening, in the private sector. Because it's clearer there. If you could bring that clarity, right? You're not going to change those relationships, but if you could bring that clarity around, okay, well, so therefore, what would this innovation look like if we were to introduce a new service or a new structure or a new go-to-market approach, et cetera. So talent, then sort of looking at that process from that kind of value chain kind of point of view. And then, as you mentioned, then it's just, and a lot of NGOs are doing this, they're looking at the methodologies that the private sector is using and looking at things about how do we build more agile teams, what is actually that agile project management methodology, and really understanding and kind of contextualizing a little in our space to say, how does it work within our space, recognizing that we do have compliance requirements that the private sector doesn't have, and how do we still feel like we can make this our own and adapt from that, even though we're going to be faced with the challenges of having to kind of report out to various stakeholders in a way that a private sector organization just doesn't need to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm going to flip in some ways, but it's still related. Fairly frequently, leaders in our NGO sector are told, especially in the US, it seems to me more than, for instance, in Europe, that they must emulate business approaches, right? I myself have mixed feelings about that. I can see the point of it, and at the same time, I feel a need to push back to some extent. So let me turn this on its head then. What can business leaders learn from NGO leaders, you think?
I also don't fully buy into the notion either that NGO leaders or not-for-profit leaders more generally need to act like for-profit business commercial leaders necessarily, right? I think it is really important, just as a sub-comment here, that we recognize that in the nonprofit space, we're doing something distinctly different than the private sector in terms of our role in civic space and civil society, and there is something fundamentally different about that. And if we make everything kind of bottom dollar driven and act like we're a private business, then we are no different, right? And so I think it is important to understand what it is that is driving us, what we're trying to do. And in terms of what business leaders can learn, so part of it is what we were talking about just a minute ago, about this notion of kind of we call it values-based leadership or whatever kind of tag you want to put on it, which is, kind of in many ways aligning that for your internal and your external stakeholders and essentially wearing it on your sleeve, right? And so any customer knows, okay, when I interact with this organization, who am I interacting with, and what is it the things that they care about first and foremost before we kind of buy a product, necessarily. And understanding, I think, trying to understand the full 360 view of then the impact of the delivery of that product and service, right? And I'm not saying all nonprofits and NGOs get that perfect either. Right? But I think in the world that we're living in now, with such sort of large interconnected global challenges, right? I think there are some things and work that's been done in the nonprofit sector around, kind of community-led development, and even things like a theory of change model, for example, that if you brought that into the private sector and said, okay, if we're going to introduce a new soft drink, for example, right? How do we sort of really understand the impact that is going to have on a whole larger set of ecosystem issues,
like
childhood obesity or water resource extraction or whatever. And some organizations already do that really well. And
so like downstream impacts.
Downstream, but maybe think of it less as downstream, right? Because I think that is a private sector way of sort of thinking about it, as opposed to thinking about like we're swimming in the same stream.
Okay.
Right? And I think, in the NGO space, especially with the push for localization, it's more about like, okay, there's less distinction between those providing the services and those in the community, right?
Yeah.
And that would be, applying that similar mindset in the private sector of saying, we're all in this stream together. There is no upstream and downstream. And so if I poison the stream, I'm poisoning my stream too.
Kind of systems thinking around that. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you two more questions. One is, so thinking about your own organizational leadership, can you tell us, you don't have to go into the specifics around it, but can you tell us about a time when you think you failed and what you learned from that about organizational leadership?
When I think about like various experiences where things have not gone well, or more importantly, where the team has felt like I've let them down in some way as a leader, I feel like if I could distill down like what was the breakdown, is that usually it was because I abandoned authenticity, approachability, and human compassion. I think generally in an organizational setting, like you can maintain a lot of, I think, organizational currency with your team by making the wrong decision for the right reasons. You lose things a lot faster from making either a right decision or a wrong decision for the wrong reasons. And at least for me, I feel like I try to be as approachable and accessible as I can, and I know that there were moments where I feel like I haven't done that, or I've executed a decision or made a decision that wasn't made in that way or communicated in that way. That has generally led to some attendant failures around that. So I see that as a kind of key piece for me, and I try to kind of stay centered on coming back to that before kind of moving ahead on certain things. But I think the more tactical decisions, like leaders are going to make mistakes all the time.
Yes.
Right. The key is is the team with you when you make those mistakes or not?
And are you able to reflect on it and learn something? Yeah. So then finally, my working title for this series of interviews is Leading with Meaning. So what does that mean to you? What is meaningful leadership to you?
I think what most people working in organizations, right, are really hungry for, I think, in terms of leaders, is they want to know who the leaders are as people. And I think it's really increasingly difficult to kind of have a very rigid wall between who you are as a person and who you are in your professional role, right? And all the normal rules about boundaries are good rules, but I think people want to increasingly really want that sense of who you are as a person. I think leading with meaning means something about consistency, right?
Interesting.
In the sense of it's really hard for people to kind of really work together if you really don't know what the leader's going to do when they come in tomorrow. Right?
Yeah.
And that consistency, again, should be related to like a really good, solid set of values. But even if I slightly disagreed with you on a particular value point, if I knew you were going to consistently argue for that point, right, and that was going to be a debate that we were going to continually to have, that's more productive than, wait a minute, I thought yesterday we were talking about something else. And then I think the third part is there are always hard decisions that are going to have to be made. And I think it's both about the willingness to make those decisions and then the willingness to kind of explain in as clear language, as simply as you possibly can, why you kind of came to that decision, right? And recognizing that not everyone's going to would come to the same conclusion. But I think you kind of get yourself into a tough spot with your team or with your organization when you sort of delay those kind of harder decisions. And I think part of leading with meaning is leaning into those harder decisions.
Leaning in. So I heard you say 3 things: authenticity, and also disclosing, like what kind of person you are consistently, and then being able to make hard decisions if necessary, communicate clearly about them, and make them in time. Don't delay them. Right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well,
Yep.
That's a very nice, strong list to end with. So thank you so much for this interview.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I know this will offer value to our audience.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tosca.
Bye-bye.
Bye.